Thank you very much. And Madam President, if you allow me, I would also like to just express our appreciation to the outgoing board and our outgoing board president and the members of the Bureau who, through this very, very challenging year, provided us with such clear guidance, support, and backup in many of the decisions that we had to make, often at very short notice. And as the video just illustrated, 2020 was in many ways a year in which we had to quickly improvise, invent, and respond in ways that we had not envisaged. And I think it is our tribute to also the board of last year that the report today will present to you an organization that indeed tried to rise to the challenge of 2020, a period where we found ourselves in the midst of a pandemic and a health emergency, an escalating humanitarian crisis, and a development emergency. And that also defined the Secretary General's leadership and that of the whole United Nations family when it put in place the three tracks: the health response, the humanitarian response, and the socioeconomic response to the pandemic. But here we are at the beginning of 2021, and it is a sobering outlook. Not only have we gained a clear idea of the impact of the pandemic on countries, peoples, businesses, livelihoods across the world, we also have to recognize that we remain in crisis mode. We are not out of crisis. For most countries, in fact, the beginning of 2021 presents even starker choices. Fiscal space has shrunk. The ability to borrow in order to invest is extremely limited. And the virus continues to affect millions and millions of people. We know that 2021 will continue to be a year in which crisis management remains central. The vaccine rollout, dealing with the socioeconomic fallout, and the fiscal and debt issues taking center stage for every government, for every prime minister and cabinet, but also for the citizens of the countries across the globe. But in looking at the crisis, we must never lose sight of the way forward. And I think in many ways, for us in UNDP, as part of the UN development system, the United Nations family, 2020 was both a challenge in terms of crisis response, but also the ability to not lose sight of a way out of this crisis, to recover development momentum. And therefore, 2020 was in many ways a pivotal moment. From the business continuity point of view, how to keep offices and teams operational, working side by side with governments under extremely challenging conditions, being able to switch to digital, as the video just showed, in 6 days, turning an entire organization with 18,000 staff in 170 countries and locations, being able to not only be in contact, but to put the digital platforms in place for decision-making, for being able to transact, to keep the financial support going. All these were elements of trying to pivot forward. And as Rob, our Chief Digital Officer, just told us, it was the first harvest of our early investment into a digital UNDP that we began a year and a half ago. But in addition to that, it was our ability to work as part of a reformed UN development system with the country teams, with the resident coordinator leading UN country teams in many different locations across the world, and working with our sister agencies in order to stand up what became the socioeconomic response of the United Nations development system and family. You have seen in my speech, the longer version that I shared with you, that this collaboration across agencies, funds, and programs with the RC leading our country teams enabled also UNDP to respond to the Secretary General's call for UNDP to provide a technical lead for the socioeconomic response. I'm pleased to report today, and that is already a figure that has been updated from when I sent you my speech, 144 socioeconomic impact assessments have now been completed, and 119 socioeconomic response strategies, recovery strategies, have been developed. This is an extraordinary effort in which I think we saw the ability of the system to stand side by side with governments who needed to quickly get data, identify those who are most vulnerable, design the response systems with their cash transfer platforms, legislative steps, budgetary reprogramming. All of these areas have been informed in part also by this collaboration that was initially designed with the head of DCO and Mara Abdullah Diaye, our colleague, who led an 11 agency ASG team to design the template for these responses. We rolled them out in literally weeks, and I'm very pleased to say, as is the Secretary General and the DSG, that truly the country teams delivered. We worked also with international financial institutions in half of the socioeconomic assessments. We worked with the World Bank and about a third with the IMF. And I think all of this has allowed countries to be able to find themselves in a better position to prioritize, to choose, which really were the two operational words for 2020. UNDP also developed the Data Futures platform, together with UN Women, the Gender Tracker, Response Tracker. These are all the resources that countries can draw on and that are very critical to the operational capacity of countries to make choices and decisions. But as you know, for us as UNDP, it was also a unique moment. We had to, within weeks, decide how to be able to respond to the priorities that countries were facing and had to address. The Offer 1.0, which we developed in March, the Prepare, Respond, Recover, was essentially our first attempt to try and pivot forward with our country presence in terms of being able to deploy immediately in an emergency situation. We established a rapid recovery fund, and within 30 days, $30 million were dispersed in 130 countries, enabling UNDP as part of the UN country team, but also in close collaboration with countries, to really respond fast. Agility, flexibility, improvisation were the driving concepts for us. And whether it was the largest ever telemedicine program in Libya that we helped to establish, or our collaboration in India on the EVIN program, which allows the tracing and coordination of vaccine centers through smartphone platforms, all of these were central to being able to enable countries to react quickly. But UNDP's mandate and really its focus also on development recovery very quickly led us to develop the Offer 2.0, Beyond Recovery towards 2030, established in July, providing a very clear set of priority offers and directions for our support to countries. The four areas we identified: governance, social protection, green recovery, and digital disruption, proved to be exactly the kind of offer that countries were really looking for in terms of support. We managed to use the global network and connectivity of UNDP not only to bring what might be UNDP lessons learned, but in fact to connect countries across the globe, because futures were being invented in every nation almost on a daily basis. Our ability to connect these efforts, including the establishment of cash transfer platforms, digital platforms, the ability to identify those being left behind, but also addressing fundamental rights, the notion of rule of law in the midst of a crisis, all of this became part of Offer 2.0. Alongside that, we reprogrammed and repurposed resources, and I want to explicitly thank our donors for being very flexible, but also the program countries, because we did that with them. And we established a rapid financing facility with over $100 million. In 16 weeks, we tasked 129 of our country teams to develop rapid concepts for helping to invest in the recovery approach and strategy. These $105 million were dispersed within 16 weeks and are now fully at work across the network of UNDP offices and teams embedded in the UN country team response. I'm pleased to report to you that, taken together, first of all, the initial 30 million I referred to, which was the rapid response facility, not only did it immediately put funds in the hands of teams who could immediately work with governments, but in fact, it also mobilized another $300 million in additional financing, over $300 million in addition to the 30. Taken together, the latest figures for 2020 indicate that UNDP managed to mobilize, through reprogramming, additional funding resources, $982 million, $1 billion effectively in direct support to countries across literally all our constituencies. And I think that figure speaks to how well that responsiveness, agility, and improvisation worked. And I want to pay a tribute both to our core donors, and here in particular also countries who increased their core funding mid-year, such as Germany, but also Japan, Denmark, and the United States, and others. I have them in my speech, so forgive me if I don't mention them all here. But this was a critical part of providing us with the added flexibility to respond. But we did not stop just in terms of COVID-19. We did not stop UNDP's overall delivery. And I want to emphasize that because our strategic plan, our work plan, clearly had very ambitious targets set for the year 2020. And notwithstanding the disruption, we try to maintain our work with our partners where necessary to adjust it to the COVID crisis, but not losing sight of many of the fundamental development programs that were underway. Be it on the climate promise, where we continue to work with 115 countries as of today in terms of updating their NDCs, connecting them also to the COVID response, a green recovery opportunity, and the ability to look at mobilizing finance in the midst of an extremely challenging investment environment. We maintained our engagement and indeed expanded it, not least because of COVID-19 in terms of crisis and fragility. We operate alongside our humanitarian colleagues in some of the most challenging environments across the world. I only mentioned Yemen, Libya, Central African Republic as examples of the kind of challenges that our teams faced, and yet also in those countries, we did not cease our operations. Indeed, we increased them during this crisis for obvious reasons and with your support. But also on issues such as gender, for instance, which in the midst of COVID-19 became increasingly obvious as a critical concern, whether gender-based violence that we saw increasing in many of the situations across the globe, whether it was in terms of identifying the unequal impact of COVID-19 on women in the informal sector and the labor market. All of these issues became a central part of our ability to mobilize data analysis and advice to countries in order to ensure that more targeted programs could be put in place. And our collaboration here with UN Women, but also with UNFPA, with UNICEF, clearly were integral to our ability to offer immediate advice on how to address these issues. And clearly poverty, inequality, livelihoods took center stage. The establishment of, for instance, the cash transfer programs, whether in Honduras, whether in Nigeria, or in many other countries, the 70 countries in which digital solutions became a part of UNDP's offer, all of these speak to our continued attempt to maintain a programmatic delivery focus. And as I speak to you in terms of numbers, I think as of 2 weeks ago, we have been able to get an overview of the 2020 delivery. I'm very pleased to report to you that overall delivery in terms of implementation in financial terms exceeded $4.5 billion for 2020. Contributions reached a new record at the level of 5.5 billion, and core funding reached almost 700 million, 696 million for 2020, which puts us almost a year ahead of the target that I had anticipated for the end of this year, where core funding would have been restored to 700 million. Remember, we were well below 600 million in the 500 million range 3 years ago. And so 2020 was also a very significant moment with over 13% increase in core funding. And again, my appreciation to all of you who chose to go down that road. But I also promised you a next generation UNDP. When we worked together 3 years ago on the strategic plan, it was a programmatic orientation that you and we all agreed needed to drive UNDP's current strategic plan, but also the notion of a next generation UNDP, a 21st century organization in the multilateral system. And I, as I hope you will have gotten from the speech, try to give you some example of how these investments have paid off. Digital UNDP just being one of them, but also our investments in business process reviews, in clustering of services, taking the latest both technology and management science into designing a global support system for a dispersed organization in 170 countries. And just to give you one indicator that I was very pleased we are now able to present to you, which is that these investments have generated significant institutional savings, cost reductions, and efficiencies. And we estimate that as a result of them, just in the period between 2018 and 2020, we have been able to repurpose over $350 million from what would have been institutional expenditures into programmatic investments. This is a very significant indicator, and I think gives you a sense of what the return on investment was of these institutional reforms. We have delivered to you now a fourth year balanced budget. We have the 15th year of a clean audit, and the financial performance clearly of the institution in the midst of this extremely challenging environment shows its resilience, but also the confidence and trust that I think UNDP enjoys amongst those who invest in us. But as you know better than anyone, we also face challenges. We have addressed, for instance, the issue of sexual exploitation and abuse very deliberately over the last few years in order to both deal with accountability, with our capacity to investigate, but also to address this issue in every team, in the culture of the organization. And we continue to be highly committed towards addressing issues of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. And these cases continue to exist, and we must deal with them as we have promised, with zero tolerance and with a very clear and consequential set of actions. We also presented to you in December the outcome of the independent audit of our GF portfolio. And as you know, this audit raised some serious concerns which we have to address head on. I try to convey to you and also to my staff that this is exactly what I intended to do. We have legacy issues, we have the present, and we have the future. And as administrator, I committed to you that I own all three of them during my tenure at the head of this organization. The management action plan that we immediately put in place is proceeding and in some parts ahead of schedule. I also established an accountability panel in order to get to the bottom about a particular project that was emblematic of some of the issues that the audit identified. And I am confident that, as promised to you, that panel will complete its work before the end of February, allowing me to take the appropriate actions that will be necessary. And I have completed the preparatory work to establish within the Executive Office a strategic controlling unit that will allow me to address some of the issues that both the report on the SNL project, but also the audit highlighted, that in essence, UNDP has many of the systems, risk management systems, procedures and policies in place, but because it is dispersed across so many different operating contexts and also in so many decision-making strings, sometimes the ability to draw these threads, all that information together, is inadequate. It was something I had identified last year, but on the back of the audit and the urgency of acting on this, I have brought forward that unit, and it will begin its operations in the month of February. I hope that, notwithstanding some of these sometimes serious shortcomings that also emerge, I have been able to convey to you, and also in the report, and whether it is on our COVID response, whether it is the paper on UNDS reform, whether it is on all the other documents that are available to you as a board, that the organization in large part is functioning in a transparent, accountable, and efficient way. Just to remind you, we manage at any point in time, on average, a portfolio of 3,500 to 4,500 projects with 18,000 staff in 170 countries. It is a complex operation. The institution needs modernization, including in its management and fiduciary systems. But we have invested. For instance, with the People for 2030 strategy, our entire human resources management is being overhauled. 84% of those recommendations have now been implemented, and I'm confident by the end of this strategic plan period this year, we will have revamped the greatest platform on which we manage the greatest asset of UNDP, its staff, the digital transformation, financial and fiduciary measures, the clustering. But in this broader context, I also wish to just remind you that there are others who are evaluating and assessing UNDP's performance independently. The Montreal Protocol, currently accounting for $1 billion plus of UNDP's portfolio, has rated UNDP as the highest performing institution of all its implementing partners. The Global Fund, which reviewed the implementation work of UNDP, which again is over $1 billion in this unique partnership we have with the Global Fund, rated in an A, B, C, D scale 100% of UNDP's projects in the A and B category, either exceeding, meeting expectations, or as adequate performance. Our independent evaluation office also produced a synthesis of all the independent country program evaluations, which again provide, I hope, to you as a board an assurance that this is a trusted organization, highly valued as a partner, and yet, notwithstanding all of this, we have work to do. I've committed to it, I'm reporting on it, and I will continue to deliver on what I have committed to you. Let me end my presentation by just a brief outlook on 2021. There is no way that we can pretend that this is going to be a year of returning to normal. COVID-19, the response, but also the recovery agenda, will continue to shape much of what we are able to do and what we need to do. But UNDP will maintain its singular focus on being able to take the 2030 agenda, the SDGs, and the decade agenda as the central compass for our work and for what we offer to countries. Whether it is the work in our finance sector hub, which is helping countries to address the enormous dilemma and challenges in mobilizing finance, public-private sector finance, whether it is the leaving no one behind focus in terms of those we need to particularly pay attention to, because in this crisis, they are likely to face the greatest and gravest consequences, or whether it is our work on governance, which accounts for 50% of our work if you look at the overall portfolio. Many of you always say UNDP is an institution that has at its core a competence on governance. The portfolio reflects that. Our commitment and focus for 2021, even in the midst of COVID-19, reinforces that. Our commitment to fragility and crisis countries continues. 9 out of 10 of our largest country programs are in fact in crisis countries with a high degree of fragility. UNDP is the best element of a joined up humanitarian development and peace nexus approach in which we can bring in the emergency and crisis situation a strong development partnership alongside the humanitarian and peace building response. It continues to be a key service that we offer to the countries concerned, but also to the international community. The climate issues remain clearly at the forefront of many, whether it is through the window of energy and the energy transition or energy access. We have a high-level dialogue on energy later this year, which will be critical in trying to bring SDG 7 back into the COVID recovery and response strategy. Whether it is the link to food systems and the other summits on biodiversity and desertification that lie ahead, these are all elements to which we can contribute with a climate, but also a green recovery focus. A third priority, our strategic plan, completing and delivering on the current one, because we still have 1 year, and engaging with you in developing and setting the pathways for UNDP for the coming 4 years, a critical building block which will culminate hopefully in a consensus in June. The UNDS reform, as you have seen in my update, but also in the Board of Auditors report and many others, the implementation of the reform measures are largely completed. It is in the rollout, it is in the living of that reform, particularly at country level, where I see UNDP's greatest focus and contribution. We must look at implementation of that reform promise. So these are just a few highlights amongst many, many different things that are happening. And I simply want to end by expressing a particular gratitude to the staff and the partners of UNDP and the UNDP family. Let me mention here explicitly also our United Nations volunteers who have kept going throughout this crisis. Our colleagues in the UN Capital Development Fund, the MPTF, and also the Office for South-South Cooperation. None of them stopped. Many of them equally stepped forward and were part of the overall UN response that was there. But particularly to our colleagues in the country teams, it is they who delivered what I have just spoken about. And together with my senior management and really all staff in UNDP, we are proud to be able to address you today at this first board meeting of 2021 and say to you, we tried the best we could. We sometimes failed, but not for lack of trying. And to all of you in the board, our partners, our donors and funders, thank you for your confidence. Thank you for your trust. We will continue in 2021 to play our part as the UN's development program, as an integral part of the UN development system, as a proud institution in the UN promise in the year after the 75th anniversary. Madam President, thank you for giving me the opportunity to address the board this morning.